I've adjusted the volume down a little bit. I noticed that the last recording was pretty loud, and so I trust that everyone will be able to hear this sufficiently. I didn't turn it down too much. The volume and quality tends to be an issue, it seems like. I have noticed also that when I play this recording back on my computer without a headset, there tends to be a humming in the background, and I'm not sure if that's just peculiar to my computer and the way I have it set up, or if you're experiencing that as well. You might let me know if you notice that. But with headphones on, I'm not running into that at all when I listen to it. So I'm hoping that if indeed that's a problem for everybody, that you have headphones that you can listen to the lectures with. This is a second part of the Chapter 5 presentation on child sexual abuse, and this will be looking at dynamics, effects, interventions, policies, and prevention in child sexual abuse. First, I have some things that I'm adding to this lecture that are not in the textbook, and this comes out of the Cynthia Cross and Tower text and put together by David Finkelhor, who is an individual who is very well known among the circles of professionals who treat sexual abuse, because he's done a great deal of research in terms of both sexual abuse victims and perpetrators. It might interest you to know that there's a study that I have a little clip about that David Finkelhor at least helped to interpret, at least, a study that stopped the average man on the street, so to speak, I believe in New York City, and the point of the study was to point out the importance of words in statistics. And so the first question that was put out was asked the men that were stopped, if you had an opportunity to rape a woman and thought you could get away with it, would you do that? And I forget the certain percentage. It was way too high. I think it was in the 30% or something like that, men who said yes. Kind of disturbing, isn't it? I mean, to think that, again, we're talking about just stopping guys on the street in a city. When the word in that question was changed to, would you force a woman to have sex with you if you thought you could get away with it, the percentage of men indicating they would do that they believe they would do that, was over 50%. Really disturbing. But David Finkelhor and other experts that were brought into this said, this doesn't necessarily indicate that these guys would do this. It's just, but in their minds, they can picture this occurring, and so that in and of itself suggests something about our culture and the saturation of sexuality and violence, and how all of that ties together in our culture, that I believe is a part of the thing that we have to address if we're going to resolve the issue of sexual abuse. This isn't something that we're going to be able to fix through individual treatment. It is alone, at least. We have to look at this from a sociological standpoint, a cultural standpoint, and address the issues of sexuality and violence, which are everywhere in our culture and in the media. But that's for another discussion. This particular slide talks about the preconditions for sexual perpetration that Dr. Finkelhor put together, and these are the kinds of things, the conditions that need to exist in order for sexual abuse to happen. In particular, he's looking at this from the standpoint of the sexual perpetrator. So the first thing is a motivation to abuse, and as a part of that motivation, there has to be an emotional congruence for the behavior. This means that the perpetrator has to have some emotional comfort with the act of sexually molesting a child, and have a need that the child fulfills. Now, how that person does that will be addressed a little bit lower in this list, but anyway, there has to be an emotional congruence. Secondly, a sexual arousal, that whatever dynamic operates in the perpetrator, and that as well we'll talk about a little later on. What are some of the dynamics that cause an adult male to be aroused to a child? And finally, a blockage of normal outlets for sexual and emotional needs. Sometimes perpetrators are fearful of their capacities to satisfy an adult woman or a woman of their own age. And so they turn to younger children because they're easy to please and because they have nothing to compare their sexuality to, and the adults' behaviors and things. And also they have more control in that relationship, and that may be another issue, that the perpetrator may not feel that he is an equal with his adult sexual partner, those kinds of things. And so these whatever reason, whatever the purpose is, this perpetrator winds up turning to the child rather than to an appropriate aged adult to fulfill his sexual urges and needs. The second condition, a precondition, is the means of overcoming internal inhibitors. In other words, he has to have some way of getting over these things within himself that says you shouldn't do this. And those means usually involve alcohol abuse or some sort of impulse control disorder, some sort of dynamic in the family which makes this easy to do and easy to justify. So they serve to, whatever it is, or a combination of these, serve to block the normal inner voice that we have that prohibits such behavior. Then there needs to be a means of overcoming external inhibitors. In other words, they have to get around the notion of, or around all those things that keep the perpetrator from being able to have a sexual contact with the child. And so having no privacy wherever the person is with the child, lacking boundaries, not a child finding children, as I was mentioning in my in part one, children who are poorly supervised and are much more vulnerable, kids who are socially isolated, those kinds of things. And also he has to have access to the victim, and so there has to be a place where he interacts with these victims. And this would be perhaps hanging out at the mall, might also be things like being a volunteer at a youth organization, or a member of a church youth group, and those kinds of things. I don't want you to believe that everybody who volunteers for youth organizations is a potential perpetrator, because that's not the case. And if it wasn't for volunteers in a lot of these organizations wouldn't exist. But it's important to understand that this is a venue where individuals who are perpetrators can gain access to kids. And so it's one of the reasons why these organizations, good youth organizations, are going to do very careful background checks. Even with background checks, sometimes they still manage to slip through, but background checks are almost always done. If you have some concerns about that with your own child, be sure to check, and encourage parents to check with organizations to see what their employee background check process is about. Finally, in the list of preconditions, the others is the means of overcoming the child's resistance. So internally and externally, both within himself as well as all those things that would tend to stop or discourage his behavior, the perpetrator has overcome them, and now he has to overcome the child's resistance, and that would include, selecting children with poor self-esteem, low self-protection skills, kids that are isolated or feeling alone, and so vulnerable to developing a close relationship with an outside adult. Sexual conduct is normalized through grooming behaviors, which we'll be talking about in an eventual slide as well. So all of these kinds of things open the door for the abuse to occur. And so it is these four things Finkelhor believes have to be put in place in order for sexual perpetration to occur. The incident of sexual abuse itself is usually nonviolent. That is, the physical violence accompanies about 20% of the incidents. So 1 out of 5 perhaps has some element of physical violence, although the perpetrator threatening physical harm to the child or to loved ones or to the child's pet, those kinds of things might occur more frequently. But long-lasting physical injuries as a result of child sexual abuse are rare. They do occur, but they're fairly rare. Other kinds of dynamics involving child sexual abuse, so when we look at the types, it's referred to in the text as severity, and I sort of cringe a little bit about that from some of my prior training, because people who work with victims will tell you there isn't any such thing as somebody who is gently molested. All forms of sexual abuse have an element of severity to it, but I guess there is still enough capacity to scale that severity more or less. And here you can see that 38% have reported instances of sexual abuse involve oral genital contact or penetration with an object, and I would assume an object could include a finger, those kinds of things, a bodily object. I don't know necessarily that means some sort of inanimate object, although it certainly does include that as well. There's a smaller percentage then that include vaginal or anal intercourse, or fondling and mutual masturbation and those kinds of things. And so there's a sort of a progression of sexual abuse behaviors that among those that are reported. Once again, I want to point out to you, probably some of those ones on the lower end of the scale don't get reported because some victims may not feel that it's sexual abuse, or may not warrant sexual abuse in the victim's mind, perhaps. But nonetheless, there are shown to be significant associations between child sexual abuse and trauma and somatization in adult years later on. For initiation of abuse, the perpetrators, as we were mentioning earlier, usually select vulnerable or at-risk children for sexual abuse. Some use fear, threats, force, subterfuge. I would also say, some of them seduce through promises and gifts and those enticements. Grooming is the behavior that is described as a premeditated behavior that is intended to manipulate the potential victim into complying with sexual abuse. So generally sexual abuse perpetrators just don't go grab a child, and again, this is sort of the image sometimes of child molesters, is that they're kind of waiting in bushes or waiting in an alley or around the corner or something, and then as the child walks past, they hold out a candy bar, and a minute or two later there's some sexual act going on. It doesn't happen like that, at least not normally. So that there are all sorts of things like enticements and the whole seduction process that but also include things though like verbal and physical intimidation, threats to hurt their parents or their pets and things like that. There are efforts made to separate the child from protective adults, and so again, and I want to caution you not to over-interpret this to mean that everybody who does this is dangerous, but the perpetrator will sometimes take the child on trips or spend a day with them somewhere and take them away from family and cultivate that relationship away and apart from the adults in the child's life. And the touching that goes on, as it says here, progresses from a non-sexual kind of touching very, very gradually to what appears to be perhaps first accidental touching of the genitals and things like that, maybe through horseplay, wrestling, and those kinds of things. And eventually it's more intentional. And each step along that way, what the perpetrator is doing is normalizing that touch and that contact, so that by the time the perpetrator has the victim to the point where he's ready to molest the victim sometimes is an easy prey. And one of the reasons sometimes why victims will feel guilt associated with this is because of the fact that they believe they cooperated and that they wanted to do it, that they were at fault, because that's one of the things, again, the perpetrator will do sometimes, is also threaten to tell the kid's parents if they say anything about it, and so the child sometimes feels like they're the person that set it up and that they're to blame for it. They're responsible, and this is all part of the dynamic and all part of the technique of the perpetrator, and not accidentally, by the way, in keeping the victim quiet. That's all called grooming behaviors. And grooming, that's a part of that, of the preconditions that we talked about earlier, overcoming the child's inhibitions. This is how it's done. The molestation isn't only confined to person-to-person presence, but as increasingly we know that perpetrators use much the same tactics over the computer and online, in chat rooms and through social media and even email and file exchanges and things like this. Perpetrators oftentimes will convince children gradually to use cameras in their computers and things like that, and begin to undress and ultimately get pictures sent to them that are distributed on the internet. And there are different stories out there about this, and it's something worth reading. There's some stories written by kids that got caught up into this, and some gone so far into being engaged in prostitution and those kinds of things, that all starting with this kind of thing, and people recruit victims for those kinds of things through the media. One of the things that I've been told in some of the trainings that I attended by individuals who investigate this particular type of abuse is that webcams are one of those things that increase the likelihood of this occurring. And in fact, I've also heard some victims say that they don't see any point to having cameras on computers, and that if it wasn't for the webcams, this kind of thing would not likely have happened. And so they were really discouraging parents from having cameras on their computers at all for that reason. Child pornography is another area that we had that I had mentioned here just a moment ago, and this creates a market for child victims, and perpetrators can use the photographs and things that they capture of children to both stimulate their victims as well as to blackmail their victims or blackmail other individuals. In particular, the kids that are the most vulnerable, we find, for prostitution are the kids that are runaway or what we call throwaway youth, who are living on the streets and need something to survive. And again, looking for some affection and somebody to look out for them. And oddly, perpetrators seem to fill that bill sometimes. For effects of child sexual abuse, but we can split them into initial and long-term effects, like we have with the other types of child maltreatment that we've talked about in the last few weeks. And the tables are in the text, and they're fairly extensive, and I'm not going to try to rehash or repeat the contents of them there, but just to kind of look at some of the overall contents of those textbooks. That sexualized behavior and post-traumatic stress disorder are the two most common effects initially of child sexual abuse, and oftentimes you see psychopathological kinds of results as well. A borderline personality disorder, depression, anxiety, and those kinds of things also occur. But in the long range, you see things like depression, anxiety, fears of intimacy, sometimes sexual adjustment issues. Sexual abuse victims could become very fearful of sex and intimacy altogether and have a phobia about closeness to others and block themselves away. Or the opposite can occur, and they become very promiscuous because they've somehow learned that their value to other people is through their sexual behaviors, what they can offer people sexually. And again, with kids with low self-esteem, this is something that they kind of find a way that they can be of some use to someone else. The interesting thing about this is that sometimes, particularly with adolescent victims in sexual abuse cases, where they may have gained something of a reputation for being promiscuous sexually, and when you're trying to prosecute their perpetrator, juries sometimes will look at the promiscuity of the adolescent and believe the adolescent fall for what the perpetrator is saying, which is that the adolescent was over sexualized and they just kind of fell for their wily ways or whatever, and juries will buy that sometimes, and based upon what they see with the child doesn't look like a victim, and what they don't understand is that these behaviors aren't the cause of the sexual abuse. It's an effect of the sexual abuse. It's an outcome. And all sorts of behavior dysfunctions, eating disorders, substance abuse, those kinds of things. With little kids, a lot of times when kids, in some cases, children are going to be reluctant to let themselves be examined anyway, because that kind of touch is not normal. But sometimes doctors will find a particularly a particular reluctance to permit medical examination and things like this, which can be an indication that kids have been violated. Post-traumatic stress, again, is another long-term effect where sometimes, I've heard from victims that as they become intimate and close with other individuals, members of the opposite sex, as older adolescents, young adults, that they experience some of the same feelings and those kinds of things that they had experienced as as a victim, as a child victim. And it could be things like not even necessarily sexual touch, although that's one of the things that might do that, but it could be just physical closeness. It could be certain smells associated with the sexual contact, or certain certain rooms or pieces of furniture, even all those kinds of things can sometimes just prompt a PTSD response in what would otherwise be a healthy and normal interaction. Some of the factors that affect the trauma that experienced by victims include duration. How long did the abuse occur? Probably, and this isn't a universal, but it goes probably makes a lot of sense that something that occurred one time is probably not going to be as traumatic as something that occurred over the course of several months or years. Not necessarily true, but more often than not. As the text has talked about earlier, the poly-victim children, the ones who have been sexually abused and physically abused and neglected, or any combination thereof, emotionally abused, the more of that kind of thing, the more different types of abuse that have occurred, the more likely it is that it's going to experience, or they're going to lead to some trauma with the victims. What type of abuse occurred? Was this a particularly sadistic type of sexual abuse, or was it particularly violent or very threatening? How far along that line of progression did the abuse really go? How old was the child when the abuse occurred? As we said, very young children may not have any memory of that. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're not going to be impacted by it, but the impact may be very different and may be something that we don't really understand because we don't know what happened. Whereas with older children who have the cognitive capacity to process what's going on, the results of that abuse may be quite different. And so, is it pre-puberty, after puberty? All those kinds of things, can impact the amount of trauma that the victims experience. The identity of the perpetrator in relationship with the victim. Again, we have this sense that child molesting is by some creepy guy in a trench coat, and as we know, it's usually by an acquaintance. We talked about that earlier, and oftentimes by a family member. And so, is this someone who the victim, really trusted? Is this a parent figure or a trusted acquaintance? Because there are other implications with that perhaps increase the trauma. Was the disclosure of the abuse, did it occur in childhood or adulthood? That will affect the amount of trauma experienced by the victim. And what was the reaction of others when the abuse was disclosed? Because a lot of times individuals won't believe the victim to begin with, or have a very negative response, and based upon the fact that we're not used to talking about sex with kids, and we don't want to believe that these kinds of things can occur. And for the parents who have been victims themselves and perhaps never resolved their issues, their child digging up these issues for them makes it very, very difficult for those parents to accept and deal with the victimization of their children. And so sometimes the reactions of those individuals around those kids is something that can increase the trauma. It's one of the reasons why it's very, very important that there is a supportive network around victims, and that treatment efforts focus upon making sure the victim know that he or she is believed. Also adding the personality structure of the victim, and this gets back to some of that discussion on the resilient child, and there are certain things about individuals and their personality that enable them to pull through some very, very difficult things that we don't really understand fully. There's a table in the textbook also that talks about all the various risk factors associated with child sexual abuse, and these include the characteristics of the child and of the perpetrator, of the child's family, of the community and culture. The community and culture, again, is this a culture that encourages violence, that encourages that sees sexuality in every interaction, and American culture really is infused with sex and violence. It's and the two of them are often portrayed together and presented together, and so in a culture such as that, the risk of these kinds of things occurring is going to happen much more frequently, and that's why I say it's important that we look at this from a much larger perspective than individual treatment. There's very little evidence that supports the victim, looking to the victim is what it is saying. In other words, blaming the victim for encouraging or allowing the abuse. Again, like we were talking about with older children sometimes who don't appear to be quite as much victim as they certainly are to unknowing adults around them. Children are developmentally incapable of giving consent, and that's the important thing to keep in mind. When you work with perpetrators, you'll hear all sorts of rationales and reasons why they believe the child wanted to have sexual contact, why the child was the one that prompted the sexual contact or caused it to occur. Their stories will be endless, and there's a piece of them that really believes that story. But it's important for the interventionist to keep in mind that no matter how it may have appeared, children do not have the maturity, the developmental capability to provide consent. So the focus should be kept on the offender in explaining child sexual abuse, and here are some factors related to that with offenders, and this kind of goes back a little bit to that list that we talked about earlier about preconditions. There has to be some sort of deviant sexual arousal, and pedophilia. Now we're going to talk about this in a second because not all offenders are pedophiles, but it's an interesting statistic out of the textbook. In fact, it says that 22%, nearly a quarter of male undergraduate students reported some sort of sexual attraction to children. So, and there's some other statistics in that particular section in the text that indicate that, perhaps we shouldn't assume that this is so deviant. And I'm not saying it's acceptable, but I am telling you that, if deviant is considered to be something that, the majority doesn't approve of, a pretty large percentage of minority are acknowledging that it occurs. And it's just an interesting thing to keep in mind. The plethysmograph is a device that is used that measures a person's sexual arousal in a clinical setting. And this is actually a kind of a machine that has a cuff that is put around the subject's penis, and this measures the slightest enlargement of the penis, just the slightest amount. And so based on that, the belief is as they show the subject of the experiment or of the study a variety of pictures of sexual situations and older and younger children and things like that, the belief is the scientists connected with this believe that they can determine what individuals are aroused to and what they're not aroused to, and where the value of this is, aside from identifying perhaps, and there's some debate about whether it actually does what it measures what it says, but the value to this is that it identifies for the treatment professional, the perpetrator is not going to be able to deny arousal to areas that they're aroused to, and then secondly, as the treatment professional is providing treatment to the offender, this also gives you a scientific, apparently objective way of going back and measuring to see if arousal patterns are changing. And so it can be very useful if it is valid. And most people in the field accept the plethysmography as a good tool to use. Cognitive distortions are something that's very familiar to sex offenders. This is one of the things that is used to disinhibit them from engaging in child sexual abuse. They say things to themselves that are patently false, that are distorted, such as the examples here: the sex with children is harmless, or children provoke adults into sex. She wanted the sex. She's really she might only be 12, but she looks like she's 18. Those kinds of things. So cognitive distortions are part of the scenarios that among those internal disinhibitors that permit offenders to carry forward with their behaviors. offenders oftentimes have a childhood history of sexual abuse. They were more likely to have been sexually abused as a child. And there are some theorists who believe that having experienced or observed victimization as a child, the offender then has learned that children can be used for sexual gratification or as a form of anxiety reduction. Back to anxiety reduction in a few moments also. And there are distinctions between child sexual abuse perpetrators, molesters, and rapists. The dynamics are very different. If we were to look at the family as a way of explaining child sexual abuse, the question is, is the sexual abuse occurring a dynamic of the way the family functions and works together? And systems theorists would believe this to be the case. And some time ago, and not too long ago actually, mothers really were blamed for a lot of the sexual abuse that occurs, or at least were given partial blame for it, because they were said to not have good marital relationships. They were sexually not available to their spouses a lot, and so maybe they're working nights a lot and things like this. And so what are the poor guys to do but to turn to their daughters? That sort of was the kind of thinking in those days. And it's sad, but that's those of you that have had me in other classes know that the fact is that in our culture, this patriarchal culture, we blame mothers and women for a lot of the ills in the world, and that's only because men are the ones that are developing the theories. But in any event, a more contemporary views really see the mother as well, personally as a co-victim, perhaps, oftentimes having a history of child sexual abuse herself, and generally, though, if you look at the family system, families where sexual abuse occurs, there is a disorganized kind of a way about the family, and members are not very close. They don't really talk with each other. They don't share things together. And so it's just a much more dysfunctional kind of dynamic in the family that theorists, at least systems theorists, would believe explain how sexual abuse occurs. In fact, at the Giarretto Institute, when I went there for training back in the early 90s, and this may be different now. We certainly, the science is developing in this, but one of the things that they stressed in working with families was that the mother-daughter relationship in a father-daughter incest situation, a father-daughter sexual abuse, the mother-daughter relationship is one of those key things to work on, because they believe that has been very fractured. If not explaining some of the sexual abuse, certainly has been fractured because of the sexual abuse, because in the dynamic of the family, the daughter has supplanted the role of the spouse. Again, that's one way of seeing this. I'm not saying that's necessarily the best way. When we look at society and culture again, look at some of the factors that contribute to sexual abuse, including gender inequality, and this means patriarchy, that men have entitlement and can have what they want. And if that means sex, that they own their wives, that they own their children. And then just again this saturation in the popular culture of sexuality and violence in our country. There are theories that integrate a number of different ways of looking, biological, social, attachment theories, and things like this that are used to explain sexual abuse occurring. Were there early developments in the child's or the offender's life, rather, that included a lot of stressful events that would lead to that child relying upon sexualized coping methods. In other words, kind of withdrawing and dealing with anxiety and tension through, frequent masturbation or fantasizing and those kinds of things. That is one of the things that we see with sex offenders is that when oftentimes the sexual abuse occurs at times when the offender is under stress, and they have an assault cycle that's not unlike the assault cycle we'll hear about when we talk about domestic violence in a few weeks. And that a stressful event occurs, and rather than dealing with their stress in a healthy fashion, they may isolate themselves and begin to sexualize, fantasize sexually and things like this to lower the stress, and that kind of sets up the the sexual abuse occurring in this particular cycle model that is fairly popular in treatment, in fact, right now. Then again, other factors being present, victim access, disinhibitors like alcohol and things like this, the offender, given all of this, may be predisposed to engage in sexually abusive behaviors. But not all offenders are pedophiles, and this comes out of the Cross and Tower material that I've been using from time to time. Nicholas Groth is a psychologist. I think he's still with us, and he studied sex offenders and rapists, I think, who were in prison, and so one of the things, and I'm not sure if Groth has studied individuals outside of prison or not, but his famous study is the one of those who were arrested and put in prison. And one of the things you have to keep in mind is this is a particularly special population, if you will, because we were talking, I think, a few weeks ago about the funnel in prosecution. That if you picture a funnel, and at the top of this funnel are all of the major crimes that are being committed, and then you look at those crimes and which were noticed, and then which of those were arrest occur, and then which of those were taken to court, and then which of those were actually prosecuted for what they were and not plea bargained, and then which of the remainder resulted in a conviction, and then which of those actually resulted in some sort of incarceration. That goes from the top to the bottom, so that you're talking about people that are in that narrow part of the funnel, and so that's why we say they're special. There has to be something about them that led to them being there, and one of the things may be the fact that they assaulted or molested individuals so frequently that eventually they were going to get caught. And we have been told that perpetrators who have been caught, that the vast majority of what they've done are never known to the treatment professionals involved, because they only talk about the things that they actually got caught doing. But in any event, Groth studied this particular population, and keeping that in mind, he comes up with some typologies which are useful in understanding the sex offender, and he split the child molester, the sex offender, into two different types of individuals. One's the regressed molester offender, the other is the fixated offender. The regressed offender usually is sexually attracted to females. Now, regressed, think about this. It means somebody who's kind of, has developed along fairly well, but something has happened in that person's life, and psychologically they're not functioning as they should be. Suddenly, they in fact, they kind of go back to earlier stages. And if you think about a little boy who's been potty trained, let's say, for instance, and does very well, and then 4 or 5 years later some trauma occurs, and he's soiling his pants, that's a regression in development, right? And so think about this as in terms of an adult, that an adult who has progressed and done well in development, but has regressed, and so in sexually speaking, in sexual adjustment, they are regressed and still attracted to females. We're talking about males here, of course. Still attracted to females as you would expect them to be, and in their minds, their primary object of sexual attraction remains other adults. They have age-appropriate objects of arousal. Okay, but they feel inadequate with individuals of their own age. This is sort of oftentimes exacerbated by a crisis or a problem in their life, and so they're not confident in their own relationship, and so they wind up turning to younger children because, well, first of all, as I mentioned, I think earlier, oftentimes they see those children as being non-judgmental and as somebody they can easily please and perhaps control. If he can't be confident enough in a sexual interaction, if he feels inadequate to please somebody of his own age, he won't have that difficulty with somebody who doesn't know anything about sex, and he'll have more control, and he'll be able to pull off things more like he wants to, and so they turn to relationships with younger children, and in their minds either see themselves as being at the developmental level of that child, and so that's these individuals who maybe like to play games with little kids in the parks and things like that. or they attribute adult characteristics to the child, and so thus the 18-year-old who sees a voluptuous 11-year-old who perhaps is developing early and in his own mind believes that, well, she's really more like an adult. So that's the regressed offender. The fixated offender is, according to Groth studies, is somebody who is sexually attracted to children. This is not they're not attracted to people their own age. They are attracted to children. This is probably more the person that we would consider to be a pedophile per se. Although I think the DSM-4 would include both of these in the actually, I don't know, because I think that DSM-4 requires a sexual attraction to children. So the fixated offender certainly is a pedophile, and fixated offenders predominantly are attracted to males. Again, we're talking about male offenders, not the females. And they are stuck at a developmental stage. Developmentally, they haven't gone forward in their development, but they're stuck for some reason at this stage, and really there's a lot of life issues that have not been resolved. And so the fixated offender is very different from the regressed offender. And if I remember correctly, in treatment, that the fixated offender is much more difficult to treat than the regressed offender, if I remember that correctly. But Groth believed that these offenders share certain characteristics, like feeling isolated and not having intimate attachments and empty, depressed. Their fantasies oftentimes replace any active, strivings on their part. They feel out of control. The world is mean to them. They have no empathy, and this lack of empathy is one of those things that has to be there. If an offender really understands what they're doing to the child when they do this behavior, they're likely not be able to follow through. They're not likely to be able to get over those internal inhibitors that would prevent them otherwise. So it's a hallmark of a sex offender that they are not able to experience empathy for others. So I mentioned the abuse cycle earlier, and Cross and Tower and others believe that the abuse cycle is really the best way to understand sexual offending, and it's also not only like the assault cycle for domestic violence offenders, but also very similar to the addiction cycle that individuals who go through substance abuse treatment become familiar with. And it's much the same kind of treatment model that is used by people who treat offenders. That is the relapse prevention model, where you don't really think you're ever going to cure this issue. You're just going to teach this person how to manage the forces in his life. So treatment has to be personalized to meet needs of the client, and I have to say the client here is not only the child victim, but is also the perpetrator, because we cannot resolve the issue of child sexual abuse only by treating victims. We have to treat everybody in the family. We have to treat the perpetrator as well. If you just get a victim out of a situation and you do nothing with the perpetrator will find another victim. You have to address the needs of the perpetrator in order to stop the cycle. So there are certain issues that professionals will encounter in their treatment, including things like countertransference, which involves an overprotectiveness of the victim sometimes, and anger at the perpetrator. And this is one thing that I think among child advocates in particular that makes it very difficult for them to effectively treat sexual abuse, because a professional certainly wants to be protective of the victim and everything, but it has to be a healthy protectiveness, and there has to be appropriate boundaries, and the professional has to have has to have the ability to step back enough to have some understanding of that there are dynamics and things behind the perpetrator's behavior that cause it to occur. And so countertransference oftentimes gets in the way of effective treatment. Sometimes sexual abuse victims who have learned that their sexuality is something that's of value to adults will display that sexuality in the presence of the professional, again doing what they know they can do they believe that will make that professional feel they're more valuable as well. And so you have to be comfortable in dealing with that effectively and assertively. Sometimes professionals have been victims themselves, and working with victims will cause that to be dug up in for the professional themselves. And certainly being a victim doesn't prevent you from being an effective treatment professional if you have dealt with those issues. If you haven't dealt with those issues, the professional really ought to give some consideration to some sort of therapy for himself or herself before beginning to work on these issues with clients. And then finally, vicarious traumatization. There's a number of different terms that are used for this. The sort of the term that's used a lot is burnout, but burnout is different from vicarious trauma, and secondary trauma is another term that's used sometimes. But basically, the professional takes on the problems of the victim and the client, and experiences some of the same emotional responses and reactions, and ultimately the view of the world changes, and this can cause a lot of complications in the professional's personal life as well. And so this is something to watch out for, to seek good mentoring and supervision and even counseling when working with clients in a situation like this. But not all survivors need treatment, but for those that do, the earlier the intervention, the better. And Ileana Gill, Gil, and I can't remember the name of her book, but she suggested that for child sexual abuse victims, one of the most effective treatment modalities was what she called episodic. If you were working with a 5 or 6 year old sexual abuse victim, and you do that for a number of weeks or months, and there's a certain point where the child has progressed and treatment kind of plateaus, and the child may be tired of coming in for therapy. The best thing might be just to stop therapy there, but to leave the door open to return. And at different points in the victim's life, when the puberty happens, when the first real serious romance or earliest sexual behaviors begin to occur, at marriage, maybe even when they have children themselves, at different points in that victim's life, it will benefit them to come back to therapy and work through those issues again, whatever has been stirred up. And of course, it's best if the same therapist is there to do that, but depending upon how long that goes, that may be a tall order, but that's called episodic treatment, and is something that can be very helpful for survivors or victims. And again, as I mentioned, I think we tend to have a vindictiveness in our thinking about perpetrators, but treatment of the problem requires that we help perpetrators change too. And we understand as we treat sex offenders that we're not curing anything. We're really working to reduce the likelihood of recidivism, relapse that is, and you do that through specific kinds of interventions that are proven to be more effective. And some of those interventions with offenders include medical approaches, and you're familiar probably with some of them if you've done any reading at all in the field. It's probably not the most frequent intervention. Insight therapies, and you have to be very careful with this with sex offenders, because oftentimes they're antisocial and antisocial personality disorders, and can be very manipulative in treatment relationships, and can be feigning insight when it's not actually happening. In fact, some of the local experts with sex offenders believe that nearly all sex offenders have antisocial personalities, that they're very manipulative, and that has to be confronted and dealt with in effective treatment. There are different family system approaches that integrate treatment of the victim and the offender and other members of the family, such as the kinds of training that is offered through the Giarretto Institute in San Jose, and cognitive behavioral techniques that challenge the distortions in thinking that offenders will have, that set up those behaviors and that lead to sexual abuse. So there is some data. There's a lot of question about whether treatment can be effective or not, and frankly, a lot of outpatient therapists are reluctant to take on working with sex offenders for fears of liability. But there is some data that suggests that at least with the less severe sex offenders, that treatment can be effective for those individuals. But some of the more severe offenders, particularly those in the prison population, don't show the same level of success in treatment. And there's certainly a lot of room for improvement in this area. At the present time, the type of treatment that is most often used with sex offenders is the relapse prevention model. Publicly, there's an increasing demand for the control of sex offenders, and a lot of different things have been put in place in order to implement that, including the sex offender registries. You can go online, and if you know the right website, actually you can find every registered sex offender around the United States. Every state of the union, I believe, has registry laws at the present time. Usually there's photographs and their physical location, and the intent of this is to help individuals know when sex offenders are in their neighborhood and those kinds of things. Legislative efforts have been made in response to the pressure from the public to manage offenders, and as the textbook points out, oftentimes the results of these are based more on the public concerns and less on good research findings that suggest that whatever intervention is mandated is effective. That this is an area of controversy and continued discussion, and will continue to be for some time. In 2006, the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act was passed. A step backwards, if you don't know who Adam Walsh is, in the 1980s in the Miami area, a 6 or 7-year-old boy was kidnapped in a mall. I was living in Florida at the time that this kidnapping occurred, and there were posters all over the state. His family was fairly well to do. They were not able to get the FBI to intervene. There were requirements involving a certain amount of time passing before the FBI could step in, or there had to be some indication that more than one state was used, and they just had a lot of problems getting law enforcement involved. There was indication, some law enforcement said, he had to be missing for 24 hours, those kinds of things, and we know that the longer kidnap victims are out of sight, the more dangerous the likelihood is of the outcome, the more likely it is that they're not coming back. And so rapid response was important, and despite the parents' best effort, it was not able to bring that about. His body was found in a drainage ditch north of Miami, I think some months later, perhaps, or weeks later anyway. His head was severed from his body, and eventually I think they found the person that did it, or at least somebody confessed to doing it, whether he actually did or not. But John Walsh, Adam Walsh's father, became an advocate for legislation to simplify and streamline reporting and responses in situations of child kidnapping. And so and you might have seen John Walsh on television. I forget the name of the television show that he used to host, but it was Looking for Offenders. It was on for many, many years. So the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act of 2006 mandates integration of the state sex offender registries, mandates certain types of sentences for crimes against children, increases prosecution for internet crimes, and also mandates background checks, national background checks on people who are interested in adopting or fostering children. There are case management considerations in addressing child sexual abuse. How do we, from a CPS perspective, for instance, and a treatment perspective, what's the best way to go forward with intervention? For instance, is it best to remove a child from a home in cases of child sexual abuse? As has been said elsewhere in the course, we know that removing children sometimes creates its own set of traumas, and so it's something that we have to consider very carefully before making the decision. And more often in cases of sexual abuse, the efforts of the states are going to be to remove the perpetrator from the home. That, however, requires the other spouse, the non-offending spouse, as we refer to her, to be strong enough and willing to bar the door, basically, and not allow the offender to come back. And that sometimes is problematic in our families. But removing the perpetrator is preferred to removing the child in most situations, so that the child's life can go on with the least amount of disruption. Another decision point is whether or not to file a petition and involve the court, or to try to treat the family without court involvement. The law enforcement has to decide whether there's enough evidence and reason to move forward with criminal cases. and treatment, what types of treatments are most effective to be utilized for everyone involved. The interviewing process for child abuse victims has gotten quite a bit of attention in the last several years, and out of this attention, the child advocacy centers have been established to provide a place that is a child-friendly environment that's safe for kids to be able to come in and talk about what occurred. The people who conduct the interviews in child advocacy centers are supposed to be at least trained in forensic interviewing techniques, so that they're very careful not to employ leading questions. And the reason for this is because, aside from providing a good environment for interviewing child abuse victims, CACs are also set up to increase the effectiveness of legal interventions and prosecution. And so there's a desire to make sure that only trained professionals conduct those interviews, and that those interviews are done in a forensically sound manner, not in a way that would have the evidence that's collected in those interviews thrown out just because of the nature of the questions that were asked. Another part of the current approach in working with child sexual abuse also is the multidisciplinary investigations, usually at the Child Advocacy Center, but it's not necessarily dependent upon the CAC, but medical, legal, social service, investigative, law enforcement, and treatment specialists all come together and staff cases together to make sure that the most effective approaches are used by all parties involved. Unfortunately, in the legal system, the common practice in many cases is the plea bargain. There are decisions to be made by the district attorney as to whether to take a case before a grand jury or not, or whether to charge them directly without a grand jury indictment. And depending upon which approach the district attorney takes, there are certain kinds of things that will or will not happen, or whether or not the person can bail out or not, and a number of different considerations, so that when the police turn the evidence over to the district attorney, the DA has to review the evidence to determine whether or not they believe they can win a case, and then again, what's the best way to approach this case in court, whether it's through direct charge or through the grand jury indictment. In the cases of prosecution of sexual abuse perpetrators, it appears as though most statistics at least say that only about 2/3 of those cases are actually taken to court, and only half of those, slightly less than half of those, actually ever reach a verdict, because DAs will reach a plea bargain with the criminal, that is, agree to lesser charges in exchange for a guilty plea to a lesser charge, or to fewer counts of sexual abuse, whatever it might be, so that the perpetrator gets a lighter sentence. The reason for that, of course, has to do with our overcrowded prisons and the overcrowded judicial system that makes trials something that gets put off forever. And this isn't something that's just a benefit to the perpetrators, because plea bargains, for instance, also make it such that the victim doesn't have to go to court and testify. And that's a major consideration in a lot of these cases, the process of testifying. And remember that the perpetrator has the right to confront his accuser. And so with the perpetrator sitting in the room, the child's asked questions about what the perpetrator did, and as you can imagine, can be a very, very difficult process for a child. And so efforts sometimes to reach plea bargains are also based upon a desire to help victims avoid further trauma, but there's a double-edged sword associated with that decision. Finally, for the prevention, there are different kinds of education programs that are being used with children, some in the school that seek to educate and empower children in terms of saying no and understanding what is proper behavior, what is okay touch, what is not. Incidentally, we've kind of gotten away from the good touch, bad touch thing because there's too much confusion in talking about touches when children have experienced strong and very intensely physically pleasurable feelings. Then labeling the thing that caused that as bad touch if you think about the connection between the two, it can be very confusing for those children as they try to understand their own sexuality and they grow into becoming sexual beings as young adults. And so there are some other terms that are now being used and other ways to go about that. But the popular thing we hear about is good touch and bad touch. But there really is no demonstrated relationship with these empowerment programs and an actual decline in the number of victims so far. And there are some criticisms about these programs that suggest that the children, the victim, is being given responsibility for preventing sexual abuse, and that parents get a false sense of security because their kids have gone through this program, as though somehow they can stop the abuse from occurring, when developmentally it's just not appropriate for anyone to expect a child to be able to do that. And perhaps the best approach to intervening in a prevention standpoint is with parents with their own children, and parents who aren't used to talking about sex with their kids may need to be given very specific instructions about how to talk with their children about sexual abuse. And when that is accomplished, studies have shown that those parents are more effective in prevention efforts themselves. And so establishing programs for parents that can help them learn how to talk with their kids about these issues is something that can be very helpful. Parents need to learn, be aware of those behaviors that are signs and symptoms of sexual abuse, and to be alert to those in their children, and to then respond to any signs that may show up with their child, so that their child is less isolated and dealing with all those other feelings that may occur as the result of the abuse.